Hello and welcome back to another podcast. I'm Ryan Murphy.
And I'm Nikki Chappell. So welcome to M365, All Things Compliance. And today we're really honoured to have Erica Toelle as our guest on our podcast today.
Hi, Erica.
Thank you so much, Nikki and Ryan, for having me. Hey, Erica Toelle. I'm a senior product marketing manager on the Microsoft Purview team, and I cover data lifecycle management and records management.
All right, thank you, Erica. So today we're going to talk through data lifecycle management, of course, and records management. And Erica is going to walk through what it provides you as a business under DLM and RM, what the benefits are of moving to Microsoft 365, what the licensing models are implied to DLM and RM, and then we'll move on to records management, where it's more tuned to your E5 license, and then what you can actually get from that. We'll talk about regulatory records, records versioning, and adaptive scope. So I'll let you take it away, Erica.
Yeah, maybe starting with one of the first misconceptions, which is that data lifecycle management is more E3 and records management is more E5. That was something I believed before coming to Microsoft, and something I've learned is not true, actually. So for example, in data lifecycle management, we do have some E5 features available, like adaptive scopes. And so it's not as clear cut as that. Yeah.
Sorry, go on. I cut you off there. So with data lifecycle management then, because you do have adaptive scopes in there in the blade, you actually do get that as part of E3 then. So you wouldn't need an E5 license to use that. Is that right, Erica?
No, adaptive scopes are definitely an E5 feature.
Right. Okay, perfect. So retention policies then under data lifecycle management, they're basically for your locations and your workloads. But there's some caveats with that, isn't there, around potentially with Teams and even with Teams private chats when they're toggled on. And once they're toggled on, the other locations are usually toggled off. Tell us why that is.
Oh, well, I'm not entirely sure the architecture reason why. There was a technical reason why they needed to separate out retention policies for Microsoft Teams chats and channel messages from other types of retention policies that cover things like Exchange mailboxes and SharePoint sites. I can't remember what the specific reason was, but it just had to do with ensuring that the policies would always be synced correctly, and architecturally, it was the most efficient to keep the service running quickly.
Got it.
So I think it's important then for the retention policies, if you want to cover all of your different services in Microsoft 365, you do have to create several, don't you? You have to create one that covers your Exchange, SharePoint and OneDrive. Then you've got, I think, Teams chat and channel messages. I think private chats are separate. And I think also Yammer, again, is a separate policy. So I think that's important when people are thinking about this, that there's lots of different services within Microsoft 365 and you can create different policies to cover all of those.
Yeah,
and I think that it is okay that it is that way. I've actually never met an organization that really needed the same retention and deletion enforcement for Teams chats as they did for SharePoint documents.
Yeah, absolutely. So most of the customers that we work with, they definitely want to separate out those locations because they may have different requirements to keep certain data for a certain amount of time. Now, Teams chats, one-to-one chats is not part of that. They will probably get rid of those every 3 to 6 months. So having that separation where the policies are applied is such a benefit for organizations. And again, with private chats, because usually they're done in private, they may contain more sensitive information. So having that as a separate entity to apply a record to, retention to, I say, is also a benefit, I think.
Absolutely. You just reminded me of something I was hoping to mention, and something I learned from Nikki actually about deleting Teams chats. So until we had like a Twitter exchange a couple months ago, I didn't realize how many people were using deletion policies on the chats to keep them around for a shorter duration, to encourage them to be more of a transitory type communication, and then putting the longer term and business decisions in Teams channels. And I've since explored it. Brilliant suggestion. I'm so glad you taught me that, Nikki. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think a lot of organisations, when they're going through that Teams maturity journey, and I think, Erica, you brought it up even with Microsoft in your team, people kind of get wedded, don't they, to just having those ad hoc chats where, that's really not the best place to store stuff, because obviously if you've got any files linked to that, that's all on your OneDrive. And if the person leaves the organisation, you've potentially got data loss there, and you haven't got that longevity that you have within the team. So yeah, sort of having that shorter retention policies does help push people. It's like that carrot and the stick. Sometimes you have to almost force people. So yeah, you could almost do it in a phased approach rather than not having any retention policies and say we're going to get rid of everything after 2 days, start phasing it in. So yeah, I mean, we really advocate that kind of the chats are just ad hoc, quick transient thing. Are you around for a quick meeting or some social chat? All business stuff should be done in the channels.
Yeah, and that was a great solution. I've since kind of looked into what the right retention period is and what different people are doing. I can't look at the customer data, right, obviously. So it's through conversations with people. And yeah, that 30 to 90 days seems to be the consensus. I would recommend not less than 30 days because if people are out on vacation or whatnot, it starts to actually hinder collaboration. We've found less than 30 days. And then also, if you were to put a 1-day deletion period, it actually can take up to 16 days to disappear from every location. So we find the 30 is also like a sweet spot for the service itself as well.
Okay, that's very useful.
Yeah, we've kind of seen the same as well. So we're talking to a customer at the moment, and they have the opportunity to put people on garden leave quite frequently, or long-term sick, or people with maternity and even paternity leave. So we've always found that 90 days the sweet spot, because it's not too long and it's not too short. Just to have it at that retention period is such a benefit for companies, and you don't get lots and lots of space accumulation in OneDrive and so on and so forth. So it's a great topic. The other thing I like about retention policies, of course, is that you can have an include and exclude. So if you select the toggle on for all, you can select a number of people or a group of people, should you wish to do so, to exclude from that policy. And that's something I find quite frequently as well, where companies have VIPs or priority users through the business. They can exclude them and keep their data for longer. And that can be down to regulatory requirements or internal compliance requirements. So I think that's a great feature to add on as well.
Yeah.
And I think the adaptive scopes as well, the new adaptive scopes come out, that works so well when you've got different regulations in different countries. So you can actually group people by those different areas and say, well, in the UK, we need to keep data for a particular period of time, but it might be in Germany or the US, you've got different kind of regulatory requirements. And that's kind of a great way to be able to kind of split up either the people or the SharePoint sites.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up. And maybe it's a good time to talk a little bit about the differences between the include exclude option and adaptive scopes. So if you were to use what we call the static option and explicitly say who's not included in the policy using Ryan's example, or including them, the downside is you have to manually keep up that list. And if a new person, changes jobs or joins the company and they should be in one of those include or exclude lists, you actually have to go edit the policy. You can put a distribution list, or I believe a mail-enabled security group in there, but it'll only do the initial population of the names. It won't keep it synced ongoing.
I think that's a really important point. I was unaware of that, actually. I didn't realise that was just a one-time thing. I thought it would maintain it as well. So that's really important to highlight that then.
Is that down to the way the engine syncs initially then, Erica? Because you have that period of days, don't you, where it basically syncs down to the data and starts to initiate that data. And I guess that one-time push of a policy is not differentiated in any way when you add more people in.
So, I mean, this is why we created adaptive scopes, is for the ongoing sync. So if you think about what the service would have to do to keep that membership up to date, if, like, let's say that a group did work in a static policy on a regular cadence, whether that's every day or every week, it would have to go and check the membership of that group, do a comparison with the last list of users that it had, see if there's any differences, and do that syncing. Just architecturally, it's not possible to do that way. That's why we invented adaptive scopes as a solution to do that. And that's literally what they do. They look at the properties of the user's Active Directory profile, of the site, or of the Microsoft 365 group, which drives Teams, and it checks that membership and then pushes any changes out to policies that utilize that scope. And it's just a way more scalable, efficient, architectural way of accomplishing that same objective.
Perfect. And with an adaptive scope, you have those attributes, of course, in the background that you can use as source anchors to link into that adaptive scope. So you've always got, if that user matches that attribute, they're always going to be included in that adaptive scope policy, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and that way we're keeping track of the membership of the scope as a unit, and then where that scope applies as a separate process, which makes it less error prone, makes it more scalable, etc.
Perfect. Anything to add there, Nikki?
Yeah, so is there a way that you can check to see, for example, which SharePoint site or which user, what policies are applied to them? Because obviously in an adaptive scope, it's not prescriptive written in there. So how do you quickly check to see what policies are related to either the user or site or group?
Yeah, so at the same time we released adaptive scopes, we also released a policy lookup tool. It's available to all licenses, and you can put in the user, the site, the group, OneDrive, whatever, and it'll tell you all the policies that apply to that location. What it doesn't do, which I wish it did, is tell us then, if there are multiple policies following the principles of retention, to which policy is actually enforcing the settings in that location. Maybe in the future we could add that.
That's a very good point. And I think the principles of retention is probably a good thing to go through, where having multiple policies, and let's say you have one for 5 years, Erica, that's published, and then you have one for 7 years, what kind of overlaps some of the people within that workload, you then have the distinguishment of which one is actually kept. So does it force to delete at the least amount of time, or does it force to delete at the maximum amount of time?
Yeah, this is something that's been standard in records management for long before we came along, right? It's always going to be the longest retention period that wins. And just to bring it back to the use case, like you've touched on it a couple times in this call, you might have different regulations from different countries, from different industry standards. Like you could also have a document that technically belongs to more than one retention schedule. And so traditionally in records management, how we've handled that is the longest retention period wins. Now, our tool is also focused on deletion. So once we start throwing deletion in there, we can make it a little more complex, but we're always going to err on the side of retention. And then if you want to know in a very detailed way exactly the logic we use to determine that, we have a great flow chart in our documentation where you could literally just take the policies that show up in the lookup tool and kind of trace them down the decision tree.
Yeah, I'll share that link in the YouTube and Spotify bios if anybody wants to take a look at that. Anything else to add from your side, Nikki?
No, I think that's really clear to show, you know, the different ways of kind of managing your different data services and how you can apply those policies. But as well as retention policies, you've also got retention labels as well. So can you just quickly explain what is the difference then between the retention label and a retention policy?
Yeah, great question. So I think of policies as applying to a container. So a mailbox, a site, a team. Whereas labels apply to individual files or mailbox items, like emails.
Okay, and I think the retention labels, they're available for most of the licensing. So I know things like a business premium license. So you do get that kind of, I think, with most of the licenses you can have.
I believe so. I will have to, let me just check my licensing page really quick.
Sure.
That's why I spent some time working on it last spring, just to ensure we always know.
No problem.
Yeah,
And I
business
know-
premium, you're right.
Yeah.
The one thing I'll mention about labels is there are a couple settings in labels that are an E5 feature, like using an event to trigger the beginning of a retention period, doing a disposition approval and review at the end of the retention period, making the item immutable by marking it as a record, etc.
And also you can use the sensitive information types, can't you, with those retention labels as well. So you can identify particular types of data, and if the item contains that data, you can automatically apply a label. I assume that's at E5 as well, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, so you're referring to our sensitive information types that we have in the Microsoft Purview solution. So sensitive information types look for patterns of that indicate sensitive data. I can only think of a US example right now, sorry. Oh, actually, let's just use a bank account number.
Yeah.
A bank account number or a SWIFT code, it has a certain pattern to it. And then when you combine it with certain keywords like Swift, you can be pretty sure you've found a Swift code. And then when that is found in an email or in a file, we could apply a sensitivity label. We could apply a retention label as well automatically.
Yes, I know in Europe that's quite useful for complying with GDPR regulations and that personal identifiable data.
Yeah,
Perfect.
absolutely. We're seeing a lot of people use it, particularly for things like GDPR, where they want to trigger a review periodically if the data hasn't been used / modified in a year or whatever the time period is. Ask the data owner, do you still need this, essentially?
Right. And as well, recently you've released the modern attachments retention period as well, where you can basically click on or link into a modern attachment, or for every modern attachment that's been shared. Now, this has been taken by one of our customers as a massive advantage, because some of their surveillance tools don't pick that up. They only pick up the link and then propose the link back. And sometimes, because the content that's in the message is down to how many characters you can pull through on that particular tool, having that modern attachment there and retained also gives them some visibility of proactive work when it comes to the discovery of that data, because they know all modern attachments now have a retention period applied to them. It's only 2 years, but it gives them 2 years enough to go through that themselves and have that deep dive, if you like, that supervision piece and the reactive piece from a discovery piece as well.
Yeah,
Excellent.
maybe just to explain to the audience a bit. So a modern attachment is when you have a file that's in OneDrive or in SharePoint, and you share the link to that file in the email or the Teams chat, instead of like physically attaching the file to the email, as an example. So what our new modern attachments feature does is when you send that message, we correlate that email or that Teams message with the actual version of the file that was shared at that time. And this is super important for a lot of financial services regulations that Ryan mentioned. It's also really useful for some internal investigation reasons as well. Like if you, because it's important, like what was the context of the document when they were talking about it can be a super important clue. So now we are able to make that correlation. And to my knowledge, I believe we're the only tool in the world that does that.
Yeah. What I also like about that is it follows the versions as well, doesn't it, Erica? So you're never without the version, even though some products take the version shared at that time, the Microsoft tool takes every version. So you've always got that link back from a discovery or an investigation perspective to find all the items, which is phenomenal. And you're right, there isn't really any tools out there that matches that from end to end.
Right. Yeah. And then what Ryan, what he just referred to is our eDiscovery Premium tool that provides that visual of the chain of data.
And that's an important thing to click onto there, is when people are thinking about the retention schedule, FilePlan has the ability to apply a lot of information in there, so you can easily identify potential regulations that they apply to, or even, a modern attachment where you can say, we know that this is a modern attachment and it needs to be kept for this amount of time. And FilePlan kind of gives you that descriptive nature of it, doesn't it, Erica?
Yeah, so I think of it as metadata on the labels. A lot of people maybe want to correlate a number with their record series to their overall company file plan, or keep track of what department this applies to, or other things. So that is available as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that feature, and some of the customers we work with, and I'm sure even in your area as well, Nikki, the customers that you have, having that there to build out that retention schedule and have that matrix to look at to easily identify what those retention labels are is such a benefit, because you can go into sometimes with some customers into the hundreds of labels.
Yeah, and I think it's a useful tool when somebody's starting out that journey. So for a lot of people, it's kind of, well, we've got a lot of data because Microsoft 365 by its nature has got unstructured data in there. It could be holding everything. So it's kind of how can you go out across a large organization and start finding those data owners, finding out what's important with them. So having that standard template that you can use to start pulling the information together to pull out those plans, and can do that in an iterative process. I think sometimes it's the people side, isn't it, and the process, which is the hardest part of the compliance journey. What is important and what's not important.
Absolutely. I was in a customer meeting yesterday, and the person asked, like, well, how long does it take to really deploy this? Like, it sounds really good, but how much is this, how painful is this going to be? And I said, well, ultimately the text the buttons are easy to click. It's how fast can you make decisions in your organization, and how fast can people change, which is a factor of many things. So you're completely right, Nikki.
Yeah, I mean, I always recommend to try and prioritize. So it's almost like that triangle, isn't it? It's looking at, what we call the crown jewels, that really important data first. Find one use case, find one department that you can start going through that process, and then sort of build on that. Particularly with large organisations, if you try and tackle it all together and try and get consensus from everyone, it becomes too overwhelming. So yeah, much more focus on the priority, and then kind of work your way down after that.
Yeah.
Just
sticking with labels there as well, one of the roadmap items that I saw that have come out this week, Erica, is the simulation mode for retention labels, which I love. I always get those cold shivers before I press publish when it comes to labels, especially when they have a delete assigned to them. So can you tell us a little bit more about simulation mode that's coming down?
Yeah, so this is an unreleased feature. So Ryan saw it on our public roadmap, which everyone can see. So simulation mode is a way you can test your retention label policies before they're deployed. So you configure the policy as you want, and then you click, go on the simulation. And then about a day later, depending on the scope of the policy and how many locations it touches, it'll show you this is the content that would have matched that policy.
Mm.
So when we first release it, it'll work with our sensitive information type auto labeling policies, as well as our KQL or property-based auto apply labels. So if you're automatically applying a retention label based on a content type, metadata, other properties.
Brilliant.
So,
Go ahead, Nikki.
Yeah, so for that, when it comes back, will there be that ability to, where you say you can see it, would you be able to click through if you'd got the relevant permissions to actually see the actual item, or you're just seeing the locations where those labels are?
Well, I can't go too much into depth with the unreleased feature, but I will say, in the Compliance Center or portal, we always try to, reuse components as much as possible for the UI components for consistency of the user experience. So you could probably expect it's going to be similar to the sensitivity label, simulation mode, or other places where you would browse a list of files.
Okay, that would be really useful, because that's useful when you're creating those sensitive information types, making sure that you haven't got too many false positives in there before you press go. So yeah, I can imagine how it will work. So that'd be a really good feature.
Yeah, I love that feature. As soon as I saw that, I had to share it with some comments, because I think that's going to make such a difference when you're working on client side. Having that simulation mode, just like the auto labeling engine as well, as you mentioned, would be so much easier to just go through and select the positives and negatives, to have that clear, defined, fine-tuned policy, if you like. Sticking with labeling, you mentioned previously, Erica, there is actually a way within 365 to apply immutability to items, and to also have some Sec 17A or other regulations that provide you to have some type of worm assessment, maybe even down to preservation log, on the policies themselves. So I know there's a couple of additional steps you need to take to enable records, aka immutable items. Can you just walk us through why that is and why they're there for use?
Yeah, absolutely. So E5 feature, and there's a couple levels of immutability available, which immutability is essentially locking the file and the metadata from being edited. So first of all, our concept of a record in M365 is whether or not it's immutable. I realize that's not the standard definition everywhere in the world, but it is what it is. And then, so a record can have just the file locked, but you can still edit the metadata, which is important for things like if you want to apply a sensitivity label later in your deployment, or other things, that's metadata. So it has to be editable to do that. Or you can lock down the actual file binary itself and the metadata. And then there's a kind of super immutable label called a regulatory record label. We recommend really using this minimally, only where needed. It really is more for those financial services regulations, and that will do things like even admins can't change the label. You mentioned preservation lock. That's you can't make any changes to the policy itself. I mean, you could make it more expansive, but you can't make it less expansive. So if you're interested in worm compliance, which is a write once, read many, we have a great white paper available on how to configure your environment to meet those regulations.
Yeah, I can include that in the bio as well for the podcast and on YouTube. Nikki?
Yeah, I think also you can have like disposition reviews as well, so you can protect that item for a particular period of time, but you may want to have a review after it. Say, for example, you're working with some legal contracts and you need to keep it, and the contract's running for 7 years, so you want to protect that data for 7 years, but you want to just review it afterwards to say, well, actually, do I genuinely want to kind of delete it if it's got a delete step afterwards, or do I need to now preserve it for a further period of time because maybe the contract's got extended? So you've got that capability as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So breaking news, we have 2 types of review available now in our records management tool. So the first one is our standard multi-stage review process, where you're assigning the review process to a label. And we find this works really well for people that have very broad reviews, where maybe only members of the compliance teams are reviewing the items. But showing up now between, I don't know exactly when you'll publish this, but today until the end of September, you'll see showing up in your tenant our new Power Automate integration in public preview. That will be useful for when you want to assign the first review task to maybe the person who created the document, or the person who last modified the document, or the site owner, where you want to have the review assignment be dynamic based on properties of the document, rather than having it be a very static process.
And I think that's really useful, because obviously people come and go, don't they? They change roles in the organisation, they leave organisations. So you don't really want to say this particular person, the person that created the document or last modified the document. You really want to target a particular job role. So obviously being able to do that and target and say, well, this is your role, whether it's the legal team, HR team, you can focus it there, and you can focus it also to multiple people. It doesn't always have to be a singular person this way. So I think that's a really good benefit.
Yeah, I really love that feature. I can't wait to see that in action. But just before we close off, Erica, Disposition also offers you the ability to use mail-enabled security groups, doesn't it? So you don't have to have an individual in there. You can actually have a group of people in there, because most of the large organizations, or even any organization, they don't just want to have one person responsible for that. You can actually have that group in there, and that can be a group of people that have responsibility for that, whatever stage of disposition is there, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you're referring to the first kind of review, which is the multi-stage disposition review. In that case, always recommend using that mail-enabled security group, even if it is one person, because then if that person leaves their role, you just have to change the membership of the group, rather than going in and editing the label itself to change the individual's name.
Which would be so much more easier, right? And so much more easier to manage from an admin perspective as well.
Absolutely.
Well,
look, Erica, this has been amazing. So thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
It's been so useful just to kind of go through the review of features. There was even things there that I didn't know, and I thought I knew quite a lot about Microsoft Purview, but I think it's like these tools, they're changing all the time. There's so many new features and functionality coming on board. It's always worth, isn't it, checking out what's going on in the roadmap. I think that's really important. You can filter down to Purview. If you've got the relevant admin access, always keep an eye out on the message center. Again, there's so many Purview changes coming on, just to see what's coming out. It's just making it so much easier to work across the organisation with all these really cool new tools coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's way too much to know for any one person to know it all. I used the example earlier of learning from you about the team's chat retention. And that's why I really am grateful that you have this podcast where we can have these conversations and share things with each other. So thank you.
You're most welcome. And for anybody watching or listening, I'll add in some links into the bio of this particular episode for Erica and for data lifecycle management and records management, so you can take your own time to search through them and even link up with Erica should you wish to do so. So Erica, Nikki, thanks very much. Been a great podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.